Ecological impact assessment is not a, I'll come back to this later again, it's not a special way of doing things, it's just the way that ecologists would do their work within EIA. It's defined as a process of identifying, quantifying and evaluating the potential impacts of defined actions. Obviously the main reason is to try and provide a scientifically defensible approach to ecosystem management. And of course it's often used in conjunction with environmental impact assessment, which also considers social and economic consequences. Within that last statement, there's a couple of quite important factors. One, ecological impact assessment is certainly in the EIA, and very often outside it doesn't act in isolation. It has to integrate with other things. And the other important thing is it's not necessary for it to be part of EIA either. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Ecological impact assessment is about assessing the impacts on things, and it applies as much to land managers outside the EIA as it does to people who are practicing for commercial development. Anyone who might be a member of EINZ, who's an ecologist, might need to know how to do this. Anyone who works in a sector which influences policy development, so that might be research. A lot of research is actually directed towards policy development. Anyone who is involved in anything that influences decision-making about development. So that could be private companies, environmental management, research scientists, government decision makers and so forth, ought to understand the principles and processes behind ecological impact assessment, because it addresses many of the inherent issues in ecology, such as uncertainty, ability to, and how you go about independently, objectively defining the same value. Anyone who makes decisions that affects the integrity of their landscape, even if these are done with the purpose of environmental enhancement. I mean, if you're park managers, conservation groups and so forth, might come under that banner. Also, I think a working knowledge of ecological impact assessment would be really useful for anyone who sees that places themselves in a position of authority to comment on the work of others. It's very useful and incredibly important to have community groups commenting on our work. It'd be much more useful if community groups commented on our work with reference to the process and methods used, and had a very, very reasonable understanding of that. And that would actually enhance our ability to do our jobs. It would actually give better support also for developments to act sustainably. Overall, the whole thing is about improving the science. So ecological impact assessment is a science. It's not just a process, it's something for which there is a very strong research base. There's a way of doing it, it's a methodology. It's designed to protect integrity, independent objectivity and scientific credibility of EIA. EIA is very often, the credibility of EIA is damaged by poor ecological work, or poor recognition of how ecological work should be done. Now, the document that we've developed so far is a synthesis of best practice. There's nothing really very novel in there. Top and tail that we've added some extra bits that were relevant more to Australia. We've taken the UK IN guidelines, we've taken Joe Charide's book, we've taken the International Association for Impact Assessment principles and guidance, and we've taken the Business Biodiversity Offsets programs, biodiversity and offsets initiatives, and we've rolled all those into one document. It's not setting out exactly how you do things, it's setting out the process by which you might do them. It's not saying this is exactly what you need to do to create an outcome in your project, but it draws on a lot of the principles, and there are a lot of tools within there, I'll talk about in a moment, that you can actually use more effectively if you understand ECIA. So why do we develop ECIA guidelines in the first place? As I was mentioned, we've got a range of tools. Survey methods, very common. People say, why are you doing ECIA guidelines? It's duplicating effort. We've already got New South Wales producing survey guidelines. Well, survey guidelines aren't ecological impact assessment, they're merely a standard on how minimum requirements for survey. Minimum requirement for survey is actually a principle of ECIA, and therefore you need to have that tool and bring it into the process. You need to know when to do it and how to do it. We don't document the skills we think are central to our work. Everyone in this room probably thinks they know how to do it, and maybe many of us do. But it'd be helpful to actually put that down on paper, agree it, and be able to tell other people about it. Because we don't do that, we've not the basis to train and mentor young professionals. There's a lot of people coming up through the ranks who perhaps don't have access to this kind of information and knowledge. Even if we believe the job's done right, who's to say it is? We can't defend that approach. We can't even put a reference in our reports. As a profession, I think we challenge, say, whether what we're doing is even working, or if there's a better way to do things. Are there better ways of doing things that are being used overseas, for example, that we could bring in? We also tend to probably wrongly assume that client risk stops at domestic acts of parliament. This is another common criticism that I'm sure will come up today and we'll discuss, that legislation domestically determines the level of minimum requirement that we can approach. There are a lot of very good examples now where that's not the case. There are other outside influences now that we as consultants perhaps have responsibility to inform our clients about. And a lot of companies want to do the right thing. They don't just want to do nothing. Sure, some clients don't, that's fine. But we are in a position of obligation to at least inform them there are risks that go beyond, say, domestic statute. The environment profession is changing. New and increasing challenges in the future that we need to rise and adapt to. Climate change, for example, being one thing. The other may just be simply that environmental pressures are going to get greater. People's expectations of what we achieve will change. Demand for skills probably almost certainly already outstrips the supply. So there's certainly a concern among the ecological profession. There's a sort of jack-of-all-trades style of work these days that ecology by its nature is driven by people who have specialist skills, and that doesn't always get recognised. And we need to recognise those qualifications and experience in professional practice and ethics. If we don't know what we're doing, it can lead us into seriously legally questionable areas of judgment, and that's an indemnity issue. It undermines the image and integrity of the profession, makes it very hard for the community and social and cultural assessors to make sense of our work. It costs an enormous amount of lost time for developers. I think this is a really big one. To my mind, if we actually did things well, it would save money. It's a factor in rapid loss of biodiversity. The biodiversity that we're losing is an integral part of human health and the economy. And we're complicit in that failure at this stage, and we need to try and move away from that. Sure, as I mentioned, decisions regularly go against what we'd like to create as outcomes, but we're not employed to think like lawyers, we're employed to think like ecologists, and that's what we're here today to do. EINZ members, I was raising this earlier, two very important points. EINZ members who sign up to the Professional Code of Conduct mandatorily as members of the EINZ accord with these two principles, and these two principles will guide the workshop today. One is to carry out professional activities as far as possible in accordance with emerging principles of sustainable development. That's emerging principles, not just the principles that are currently in play, and the highest standards of environmental protection. And secondly, at all times, place the integrity of the natural environment and the health, safety and welfare of the human community above any commitment to sectional or private interests. Development of best practice shouldn't really be influenced by current minimal legal requirements. It should recognise it, but not necessarily be influenced by it. And the primary objective is to start to recognise that and create a foundation for meeting biodiversity objectives in the long term. Okay. Central to assessment is a proper, independent and objective valuing of biodiversity. We'll keep coming back to this today. It's all about valuation. There are tools available in states to do this. There are many biodiversity tools available that fit into this. Survey guidelines and so forth. EciA is the framework in which all these things fit. It's dependent on integrating with other disciplines, as I mentioned earlier. I'll skip through that slide. Critically, there is a proper and defensible way of doing it that's maybe not well recognised at this stage. It follows an ordered process. Uncertainty is inherent, it deals with that. Early planning and scoping is really important. Scoping is not in the vocabulary in Australian statute or policy. Early scoping, understanding the terms of reference at the start, doing proper community consultation so your entire EIA process doesn't just blow out of proportion or end up with a massive legal dispute at the last minute. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to drive towards. The ecological impact assessment best practice information recognises biodiversity at the landscape level and how to go about considering that and what's important and what isn't important. So EINZ's in a unique position, I think, to do this. EINZ members and people such as those in this room are in a unique position to influence this. We're here to try to introduce a consistent and agreeable framework for ecological working practice, particularly where this is done in conjunction with statutory EIA and the principles of sustainable development, therefore biodiversity conservation. It should benefit those who work in ecological practice, those who commission such work, and those who depend on its outcomes to maintain a healthy functioning ecosystem. The objectives are to develop a professional reference document that facilitates design, implementation and ongoing development of ecological impact assessment best practice, and to set out the latest and internationally recognised scientific methods available to practitioners for creating biodiversity outcomes in their work.